Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Helen Julia Paul. Helen is a distinguished historian, and today we're going to be talking about one of her fascinating papers, the maintenance of British slaving forts in African, the maintenance of British slaving forts in Africa, the activities of joint stock companies and the Royal Navy. Helen, why are forts important? And what was the Royal African Company?
Well, the Royal African Company was essentially a trading company set up with a monopoly granted by the English Crown, which later became the British Crown. And it was supposed to trade with Africans on the West African coast, but became essentially a company involved in enslavement. So its major good that it sold was trafficked human beings. And that's why it's important not just to look at in an economic sense, but also morally. So that's that part of the enslavement history. In terms of the forts, it had forts along the West African coast. So did other countries. And you can see a lot of European forts dotted along the coastline, which sometimes changed hands between different European groups, but essentially acted as a locus or loci where African traders and European traders could come together and store goods, but also store human beings ready to be put onto the slave ships. So the forts have multiple roles, and they're interesting for a number of different reasons, really.
Helen, I like your paper because it's fascinating and comments on a wide ranging set of issues. But before we get to these issues, we're going to talk more about forts trading and Africans. Were forts profitable for Europeans?
Well, this is very hard to work out. The arguments against them, people who wanted to overcome a company monopoly, they were saying we shouldn't have this monopoly. These forts are nothing but empty walls. And essentially, in some cases, when we say fort, you might think of something very grand, but some of the quote unquote forts were essentially just storehouses with a bit of protection, just to store trading goods that had maybe gone unsold, or to store human beings, but temporarily. And some of them were not in very good repair. Others, on the other hand, were really impressive buildings like Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. And those buildings survive. So we tend to think of the forts as being like Cape Coast Castle, but in reality, some of them were pretty shoddy and were not very impressive at all. What they were was somewhere that you stored a lot of the goods you didn't sell. Because African traders, usually slave traders, wanted a range of different European goods and also Asian goods, things that they could get from the European ships, but they didn't necessarily want the same things every time. So there was very complicated trade of working out what your African trading partner would want this time. And so one of the reasons for the forts is to keep a permanent personnel on shore to learn more about what was going on within the various African groups, and also to keep local African leaders on side in some way, to say, to give them presents, to turn up at ceremonies, to defer to them, to also keep an eye out for various wars between the different African groups. But there were other ways of doing this. You could trade from ships. You didn't necessarily have to trade from forts. And there was this ongoing discussion about whether the forts were really worth it or not.
You're right, because the Africans had such specific demands, learning how to trade with Africans could take up to 2 years. That's what you write in your paper.
That's absolutely correct. It took an awful lot of effort. As you went down the coast, the requirements could change. So it could be that one group preferred a certain color of cloth and other people wanted a different kind of cloth, because you're not dealing with the same ethnic group each time. Then as well, you also don't know quite what the other European traders are bringing. So that could be people who were French or Brandenburger, they could be anybody, and they had their own forts and their own systems. Or you also had other British traders who were trading from ships, and they were bringing things as well. So you didn't necessarily know always what was overstocked and what was undersupplied. And you have changing tastes. So you have the Africans driving a consumer goods debate, a consumer goods market about we want this and we want that. If you want the enslaved Africans that we have, you've got to bring us what we want. And what we want can change a lot over time. So that was part of the complexity of it.
And Helen, you're going to tell us a little bit more about this, because I have read it in your article and in several other articles that the Europeans had to comply with African trading terms.
Absolutely. They had got themselves into a situation where they were reliant on a lot of labor to, for example, mine precious metals in the Americas, or to work in plantations, sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And the question was, where was that labor going to come from? You had indigenous peoples who could be made to work, and some of them were enslaved. But basically, they also fell foul of imported European illnesses, or rather, when we say European illnesses, the Europeans were the vectors of disease. They're bringing diseases to indigenous people that they were not, had no contact with before, so they didn't have much resistance to them. You also have a high mortality rate in, say, the silver mines or on the sugar plantations. This is really hard work. And basically, it was cheaper to use enslaved people and work them to death than it was to use free laborers or to essentially breed up your own enslaved people. Because certainly in the sugar plantations, they relied on male enslaved people who would be worked to death, and then you get in more. Now, as it happens, unfortunately, for the West Africans, that was where they were going to pick up the enslaved people because, well, a variety of factors. Basically, if you look at the routes, the sea routes, it's relatively straightforward to sail down from Europe to the African coast, across the Atlantic, and then back around, back up to Europe again in what's called the triangular trade. So the winds and currents would help a sailing ship do that. So although Africans produced a range of different things like cloth and gold and ivory, they ended up specializing in people, in trading in people, essentially. And that was their big comparative advantage. That was the big selling point they had. The Europeans wanted those people, and therefore they had to comply with what the Africans and Euro-African slave traders wanted to have. And there wasn't one basic currency. So you were essentially in some kind of barter situation. That suited the Africans. It was more complicated for the Europeans, but the Africans had a lot of power in this. And that really drives a lot of the trade.
Helen, the forts that were in Africa, did the Europeans pay Africans to build them?
Well,
Or yes, continue.
And pay Africans to build them. Some of them were built by people who were brought in from Europe, especially to build a fort. So some of the better built forts were built with imported labor. In terms of why is there a fort on that particular site, the land underneath the fort belonged to the local African king, and a ground rent had to be paid. So we talk about the forts as belonging to a particular country or a particular company, but in reality, it was rented land. And if you didn't provide the trading goods that you were expected to provide, the local king might just say, well, I'm giving that fort over to this other country, this other group of Europeans. And that was seen as perfectly legitimate. That was basically, you'd failed to keep your side of a bargain, so it was all right for that fort to be handed over to someone else. And interestingly, some of these European forts were quite close to each other, even within sight of each other, or quite next to each other. And part of that is that it suited the Africans to have that inbuilt competition between the Europeans. So the siting of forts as well is very interesting and shows you a lot about the local power on the ground.
Helen, why did competition between the Europeans benefit Africans? You also explored this in your paper.
Yeah, part of it is if you're trading exactly the same thing, you have price competition, obviously. You're going to be pushed down on price. You can think of it really as different groups of people trading in more or less the same things, but located near to each other. We can see that happening with, say, estate agents that are connected to each other, that are next door to each other, or jewelers shops that are in a particular area. You start to see the competition on price. Also, the type of goods as well. Europeans were selling guns to African and Euro-African traders. And that was one of the really useful European goods, if you can use the word useful, because of course, for the slave traders, guns were useful to deal with farming. You could chase away wild animals from your agricultural area, but you could also use them against unarmed civilians to capture them, and you could menace people with guns to keep them under your control. For the Europeans, there was a problem that you don't want your trading partner to be too well armed in case they turn against you. So ideally, a European would want to sell low quality guns, but then you're in competition with a different European nation who might want the same thing. They might want to palm off low quality guns onto the Africans, but the Africans themselves want a better quality of gun. So you start to see this competition where, for example, English guns started to be preferred by Africans over the Dutch guns that were available. But the English themselves weren't selling the absolute best quality guns to these Africans. So you have a strange kind of tension between keeping the best guns for your own military and your own navy and selling off the lower quality ones to Africa, but keeping them at such a level that you outperform a European rival who's probably thinking in a very similar way to you.
Helen, when I was reading your paper, I said these Africans appear to be quite strategic and intelligent, because it's obvious that even though Africans were being exported as slaves without their choice, African elites knew how to manipulate Europeans. I've read writers who argued that Africans refer to the Dutch as a subject of the Asante people.
I think there's certainly that idea, because when you're there, you are in somebody else's kingdom, and you get different kings showing their kingship or their leadership, or female rulers as well, in a very similar way. So you have formal ceremonial rituals that are showing deference to the local leaders. You have presents that are made to the local leaders. You have artworks that show European traders as being subordinate to the local leaders. And there's a very interesting ivory mask that's held, I think, in the British Museum, which shows a very large face of an African. And then on top of this person's head are all these little heads with beards. And what these little heads are Portuguese traders. So the idea is they're like a hair ornament on top of this larger African face. So they're subordinate with this. You sometimes see as well the Benin bronzes that have been in the news that are going back to Nigeria from various museums in Europe. They often show something around the trading relationships. So you see people holding what are called manillas, a kind of curved horseshoe-like metal object that was used as a type of trading good / currency, and still was being used in Nigeria up into the late 20th century. So these manillas, again, are being shown, and yet they would be coming in from Europe. So you're showing, I have this imported object. And when you look at places like Ouida, which is it's labeled as a slaving port. It's not really a port because
Helen,
sorry.
OUIDH and HUED. Pronounce them, please.
OUIDAH.
Yes.
I would pronounce it as Ouida or Wida.
And the name of the other region, HUEDA.
That's also Ouida.
Yeah, yes, because that's how I pronounce them, but I will say maybe I'm wrong.
The thing is that the same word reappears in different ways. So there's Ouida, the place, the Ouida people, and then from that, you also find that the word appears in the Americas as well. So there's places called Ouida. There's, I think, a bird called a Ouida bird. And so you see it spelled different ways. Basically, there is a port, which I'm going to call Ouida. And it's not really a port as such. You can't bring in ships. You have to anchor them offshore, get into a canoe, get over a sandbar of some sort, and then you get into the town proper. In that town were 3 European, quote unquote, forts, but they're inside the city. So to my mind, that shows a subordination to the local power. You're going to put your fort here. It's going to be next to that person's fort and this other fort. And essentially, it's going to be like a storehouse of goods, but you're under my control, because obviously those forts, they can keep out burglars, but they can't keep out the local army. They're not that impressive. So you have a sense of subordination to the local African leader right there.
Exactly, as you write. The Ouida chose to bring several European nations to their trading centers. On the Gold Coast, local elites allowed 1 European group per trading town.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes they did that, so you have that issue you can deal with that particular person, but then you'd have further away a different European group. So there was never this sense that one European nation could start to control territory. They were always there as a guest. This is very different to the later 19th century with the scramble for Africa, where you get Europeans starting to say, we're going to take that land. This is your land. This is all decided more or less by the Africans.
And Helen, Africa under the comparative advantage in iron, we actually have a litany of 21st century papers published in 2020, 2022, arguing that Africans were innovative producers. They also produce cloth. So why did elites import goods from Africa?
From outside Africa.
Sorry, from Europe.
Yes, that's interesting because, of course, there is this long tradition of metalwork in Africa. There's a certain importance to the person who is the metal worker. They have a lot of ritual powers that are also partly supernatural. Why not use them? And the answer to that is really imported goods that are expensive are a kind of Veblen good. They show you have status. So yes, you can make your own cloth and you can make your own metal. But if you get something in that's clearly an import, it's a bit like, why do you have to have a branded watch or a branded handbag today? Why do you have to have an expensive object about your person? Because it shows your status. If this is something that's come in from somewhere else, cowrie shells being an obvious one, they come some distance. They're pretty plentiful where they originate, but then there's loads of them brought long distances into Africa and incorporated into African culture because it's an imported good. It's a status symbol. It's like having a brand name across your chest on a sweatshirt or something. Why do you need that there? Because people know it's expensive.
Exactly, because some people criticize Africans for importing goods that they could have produced. But I always remind them that Africans were specialized consumers. They had a direct taste for particular goods. And if Europeans had a different form of iron and they liked that iron, they requested it. So it was not the case where the Europeans were imposing these goods on Africans to undermine African industries. Africans had agency in importing such goods.
Yeah, I don't think there was a lot of strategic thinking from the European traders about undermining African industries at all. That idea of the center of an empire imposing its rules on a colony, that comes later into the 19th century. That's when you start to see European nations stopping their colonies from developing. And you see this to some degree with the Spanish Empire and its colonies in the Americas, blocking them from developing their own manufactures. But that's not the same as the African forts, because those are not really colonies as such.
And even during the colonial period, Europeans had to collaborate with African chiefs.
Well, it was much easier to do that. The history of empire is always one of some sort of cooperation. You either destroy the local elite and then you have problems doing that, or you co-opt them in some way. If you look at the Roman Empire, they did very similar things. They tried to co-opt a local elite, and sometimes it didn't work, but sometimes it did. It is much easier to get the local power structure on your side than to smash it down and start again.
Yes, the Aztecs, they also had a history of working with local elites, but local elites would then try to usurp their authority. So it wasn't quite successful in their case.
You see it, there's a kind of tension between, will I do better within your empire, or will I do better going it alone? I mean, one of the people that went against the Roman Empire, a Gaul called Vercingetorix, who's very famous in France, he had been basically compliant for a very long time and then turned against the empire. And it can be for a variety of personal reasons or cultural reasons or some other reason. But yes, you always have this tension when you're trying to push out an empire as to whether you can trust your subordinate mini king or whoever it is you've put in place.
Helen, I'm going to stray just a little bit from the topic, but I am interested in the emergence of a bourgeois class in the Asante Empire and the factors that led to its demise. Are you interested in that topic?
I'm interested in it. I don't know whether I'm an expert on it. Yes, certainly the Ashanti are, when you start to get bigger and more powerful, you start to get a more stratified class system appearing, and people who come to prominence who maybe wouldn't have done so before. But certainly, you know, I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Yes, some of the older writers like Kwame Hina and Ivor Wilkins, they started the research, but I would love to see newer articles on the topic. I'm from Jamaica, and many of the slaves who were taken to Jamaica, they came from the subject states of the Asante Empire and the Bight of Biafra. So I'm interested in the Asante people, their subject states, and the Igbo people.
Right, and certainly now you're getting more and more DNA testing. You've got more clarification as to exactly where people came from. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, like the Congo, some of our slaves actually came from the Congo. We had some of the earlier slaves who came from the Congo apparently were literate, and some of the later slaves came from the Congo. That's interesting because before we just assumed that many of us were from the Gold Coast. But the Congo and Islamic slaves, apparently some were also Muslim.
Well, certainly there's much more clarification now, because a lot of those people were simply loaded onto ships and you don't know their names or anything. You just have numbers of how many people were on the ship. So a lot of that information was lost. Now we're getting it back again through DNA.
And we're also getting information on how Africans in the New World incorporated themselves into a foreign society and also combined African culture with local cultures and with foreign cultures.
Yeah, and certainly if you can track that back, it's really fascinating. Things like food or rice cultivation, where you start to see traditions that are going right the way back. That is interesting as well, I think. Or music, dance, things that are clearly connected back. And yes, as well, this cultural mixing is interesting too.
And even infrastructure. So I'm not surprised that some enslaved workers were skilled people, because in places like the Asante and Benin, people knew how to make various tools. So I'm not surprised that in the New World, what we call the New World, then they built bridges and houses. I'm not surprised.
No, certainly there would be a mix of different people. And as well, it's interesting to work out who gets targeted. You know, some of them would be people from inside that particular ethnic group or social group, but some would be, as you say, subordinate kingdoms, or somebody would go and do raids elsewhere, further away. And I think it was the Fantis who actually, the king of the Fantis, enslaved too many of his own people and actually weakened his kingdom to the sense that it was then overrun by a rival kingdom. So you had this tension of exactly who do you let go. If you let go of skilled people, that's a problem for you. If you let go of unskilled people, that's one thing, but which unskilled people? You have this tension within the slaving kingdom of how to maintain control, because it must have been terrifying to think that you could be on the ship next. They didn't know where they were going.
Yes, and unfortunately, some village kings and elites were either kidnapped or tricked into slavery. So
Mhm.
in Jamaica, the Maroons, many of them were from the elite in Africa.
That's very interesting.
Yes, they were from
Yeah.
the upper class in Africa. So it was difficult for them to adjust to the system of enslavement.
And that might help to explain why they had maybe some leadership skills, or why they were seen to be natural leaders. There might be some supernatural religious belief that they were superior in some way. So they could be easier to get people to themselves. But also, I mean, just a bit more cynically, if nobody knows what your ancestry is, you can say what you like about what your status was. It's interesting that they state that, because they're sort of saying it's all right for other people to be enslaved, but it wasn't all right for it to happen to me, which is
Exactly
different.
my point.
Yeah,
Like Taki,
yes.
Taki was a village king and he was accustomed to the practice of slavery, but he had a problem when he was in Jamaica as a
Mhm.
slave. So you're
He,
exactly right.
yeah, he got a taste of his own medicine, unfortunately. Yes.
I've not read Vincent Brown's book yet. He has a book on the revolution. Have you seen it?
I haven't actually. I haven't seen that one yet, but I've certainly come across Vincent Brown. So,
Yeah, I've not seen. Maybe I should have him on the show at some point.
absolutely.
No, Helena, I'm on page 9 of your paper, and this is where you divulge into the nitty-gritty of African alliances with the Europeans. So you're right. The kingdom of Fetu also helped a Dane capture the main Swedish fort of Karolsberg at Cape Coast. The king of Denkyira intervened in European affairs, and his messages accompanied the English to the king of Aquamo to ask if they could settle at Alampo. It's so fascinating how Africans worked with Europeans to undermine Europeans and other Africans.
Absolutely. Because the idea of, if you like, African unity probably didn't really exist back then. The idea of, well, this group is our group, because an external view would be, for the Europeans, would be these people are all Africans. But once you get closer, you start to realize actually, no, they're different ethnic groups, different kingdoms, they have different languages, different views on things. And just like in Europe, where you have different kings vying for power, you have the same in Africa. So they would work alongside whoever it is they took a liking to, that they trusted, and whoever could bring them the things that they wanted. So there were these political undercurrents going on all the time. But also you notice that you still need the permission of the local king really to do anything major, like take over a fort or anything of that sort.
And Africans also employed Europeans as judges?
Where is that coming from?
No,
Just remind me.
yes, because he said that when there were certain cases, the Africans viewed the Europeans as impartial.
You could do that. So certainly you have issues about judgments being made by people who were men from trading companies. So you have, if you like, the impartial judge on some particular issue. You also have the company's people judging pirates who'd been captured by the Royal Navy. So they had those roles. They had a kind of quasi-diplomatic, quasi-governmental role, which is interesting as well, because that's part of the justification of having the forts, is that you're creating an almost state-like apparatus, but within somebody else's kingdom.
Helen, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm actually working on a book on the Bubble Act, a piece of legislation that came after the South Sea Bubble. And then I'm going to start on my book to do with a Scottish colony in Panama called the Darien Scheme.
So have you written books on Africa?
I've written chapters on African history, but I haven't written an entire book on it.
Why? What are you waiting on?
I suppose I've just got so many other things to do as well. I've got a backlog of stuff that I need to write. And I also have colleagues who are Africanists, pure and simple. They do African economic history.
Oh yes, I know you're an economic historian. I know you write on British economic history, especially its financial history. But I read your paper on Africa and it was just so interesting.
Yeah, I work more on kind of Atlantic history of how these things interconnect, while as I think some of my colleagues write solely on Africa on the ground, land-based history, as opposed to the ocean and its connections.
Helen, I don't know if you have been following this development, but Scottish history is experiencing a renaissance, especially the impact of the Scots in the Caribbean.
Absolutely, I have been following it. My parents were from Scotland, so I take a very deep interest in it. As well, my cousins were graduates of the University of Glasgow, and I know that Glasgow has got involved in a reparation activity with, I think there's a university in the Caribbean.
The University of the West Indies.
That's it, that's the one. So they have that link, and they've written about the sugar and tobacco barons of Glasgow. So certainly that is something that reminds me of my childhood, because my mum came from Greenock, and that was one of the areas where there were sugar houses and tobacco factories.
And there's also the intersection of technology, economic growth, and slavery. So Europeans and Africans in the Caribbean were experimenting. They were investing in chemistry and research. There are two new papers that I plan to read, published by foreigners, but they explore the role of the Scots in the economy in the Caribbean. They were looking at science and technology. So it's not no, but at one point it was thought that the Caribbean was not a contributor to the industrial enlightenment, but new literature has emerged proving otherwise.
Absolutely, and Caribbean was shown as a kind of backwater where you dumped people who'd made a mess in Europe and you just sent them out to be plantation managers. And it didn't look at the intellectual culture of the Caribbean. But who wrote the papers that you're interested in?
Yeah, so one person, her name is Nicole. I can't pronounce her last name at the moment, but I can tell you the journals. One journal is Britain and World History, and the other journal, let me look at it because I'm online. It's written by somebody called Joseph. Hold on for a minute. I'm going to find it now. Yes, Joseph Wagner. This is in the Scottish Historical Review, 2021.
Review. So yeah, the lady who's, did you say her name was Nicole?
Yeah, her name is Nicole, and her paper is in Britain and World History. and I'm going to see if I can find her. It's called Sugar Rush, Sugar and Science in the British Caribbean. Nicole Jacob Berger.
Nicole Jacob Berger.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's papers on copper.
Yeah, I've read those by Noah Live. I've read them.
By Nuala, yes, Nuala Zahedia. So I wondered if that was the person you were going to say, because her surname is sometimes hard to pronounce as well. But yes, Nuala, who worked at, talking of Scotland, she was working at the University of Edinburgh. So it all comes back around.
But I will be planning to read your books on British economic history. And if you have chapters on Africa, you can send them to me.
Absolutely.
If I can find the PDF. But yeah, I would love to read them. I've been doing a lot of research on African history.
I shall write that down.
And Helen, so you're a distinguished historian, but you seem so elated to appear on the show. Why?
Well, I mean, I'm delighted to talk about the forts. I haven't looked at them for a while, but I was really interested in them. They appear now, some of them, as tourist attractions with a kind of dark tourism, where you go and, for some people, it's their own ancestry that they're going to try and connect back to. The idea of, this is where my ancestor might have been held. It's really interesting, but sad as well. I've never been to these forts. I would love to go, because they are basically some of the only things that are really left for people to go and visit.
Yes, it's quite emotional for some people, but I really like the renaissance that's taking place in African history. So Helen, we're wrapping up, but speaking to you has been a pleasure, and we're going to talk again.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
Yes, you're such a cheerful guest.
It's not a cheerful subject, but thank you.
You're right. All right, bye Helen.
Bye-bye.